The year is 647 BCE. In the conquered city of Susa, capital of Elam, smoke still rises from the ziggurat that burned for 7 days. The Assyrian army of King Ashurbanipal has just finished what they call pacification. The streets are empty now, not because people fled, but because there are no people left to fill them. Except in one corner of the city, in what used to be the royal quarter, there is movement. A line of women, hands bound with rope made from their own hair, waits in silence. Not the silence of acceptance, the silence of souls that have already broken. These are the wives, daughters, and sisters of Elamite nobles who resisted Assyrian rule. They range in age from 12 to 60. Some still wear fragments of silk, now torn and bloodstained. Others have been stripped bare, not for violation yet, but so the Assyrian soldiers can count them more easily, recording numbers in clay tablets that will survive 26 centuries and end up in the British Museum. The woman at the front of the line, whose name was Shali Firstar, though it will be erased from every record within the month, is 23 years old. She was married 6 days ago. Her husband's head is currently mounted on a stake outside the city gates, one of hundreds arranged in neat rows, as a message to anyone who might still harbor thoughts of rebellion. She does not know it yet, but in less than an hour, she will experience something that Assyrian kings documented with such pride that they had artists carve it in relief on palace walls for visitors to admire. This is not a story about war. War has rules, even in the ancient world. This is a story about what happens when cruelty becomes policy. When the systematic brutalization of women isn't an unfortunate side effect of conquest, but a central strategy of empire. The Assyrians didn't hide what they did. They advertised it. They wanted the world to know exactly what awaited those who defied them. First, if you've ever wondered why certain civilizations were so feared, that neighboring kingdoms would surrender without a fight, you're about to understand. And if you're interested in the primary source documents, the royal annals preserved in cuneiform, the archaeological evidence from Nineveh and Nimrod, subscribe. We dig into archives that most historians prefer to summarize, rather than quote directly. Now let's go back to that line of women, because what happens next was so common in Assyrian military operations that they had a standard administrative procedure for it. The Assyrian Empire, which dominated the ancient Near East from roughly 900 to 612 BCE, was not the first great power, but it was the first to make terror a science. Earlier empires, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, had been brutal in victory. But the Assyrians transformed brutality from an act of passion into a calculated tool of statecraft. They didn't just defeat enemies, they erased them. And women, captured in the wake of military campaigns, became instruments of that erasure. Here is what we know from primary sources, and all of this is documented in archaeological evidence discovered over the past century and a half. First, from the annals of King Ashurnasirpal I, who reigned from 883 to 859 BCE, discovered inscribed on tablets in the temple at Nimrod, and translated by archaeologist Albert Kirk Grayson in his work Assyrian Royal First Inscriptions, published in 1976. First quote, "I conquered the city. I carried off their booty. I destroyed, I devastated, I burned with fire. I captured soldiers alive and erected them on stakes before their cities. Their youth and their maidens I burned in fire. The city I turned into ruined hills." End quote. That phrase, "their youth and their maidens I burned in fire," is not metaphorical. Relief carvings from Ashurnasirpal's palace at Kalhu, now housed in the British Museum, show exactly what it describes. Women and children, distinguishable by their clothing and smaller stature, being herded into buildings that are then set ablaze. Assyrian soldiers stand guard at the exits with spears, ensuring no one escapes. These reliefs were not hidden in storage rooms. They lined the main entrance halls, meant to be seen by visiting dignitaries, foreign ambassadors, anyone who needed to understand what resistance to Assyria meant. Second, the practice was not limited to one king or one era. From the annals of Tiglath-Pileser II, who ruled from 745 to 727 BCE, comes this notation recorded on the clay tablets discovered in the ruins of his palace at Kalhu. The city of Arpad I besieged and conquered. Their fighting men I put to the sword. Their women, their children, I carried off. The city I destroyed, I devastated. I turned into ruin hills and heaps. The phrase, their women, their children, I carried off requires unpacking. Carried off where? To what purpose? We have the answer from administrative tablets, boring bureaucratic records that are somehow more disturbing than the boasting of royal annals. These tablets, discovered in the Assyrian archives and published in the Neo-Assyrian Text Corpus Project, list women by category: captives for temple service, captives for royal household, captives for distribution to soldiers, and captives for sale. Each category has a number beside it. In one tablet from the reign of Sargon II, 722 to 705 BCE, found in the palace archives at Khorsabad, the breakdown is chillingly precise. 630 women assigned to temple prostitution, 420 to the royal harem, 300 to military distribution, 250 to slave markets. These were not prisoners of war in any meaningful sense. They were inventory. But before we discuss where they went, we need to discuss what happened to them first. Because the journey from captured city to Assyrian territory was itself a form of torture. Third, from the annals of Sennacherib, 705 to 681 BCE, we learn about the march. After the conquest of Babylon in 689 BCE, a campaign documented in multiple sources, including his own inscriptions and Babylonian chronicles, Sennacherib records the deportation of over 200,000 people. The majority were women and children. The march from Babylon to Assyria was roughly 500 miles through desert and mountain terrain. No provisions were given. Captives were expected to survive on what they could forage, which meant they did not survive at all. Mass graves discovered along the route, excavated by archaeologists in the 1980s, and analyzed using modern forensic techniques, showed death rates exceeding 70%. The bodies are overwhelmingly female, overwhelmingly young. Cause of death: starvation, dehydration, and in many cases, blunt force trauma consistent with being beaten with the butt of a spear. Those who did survive the march faced something worse. Fourth, from letters preserved in the state archives of Assyria, correspondence between Assyrian governors and the royal court, we learn about the processing system. When female captives arrived in Assyrian territory, they were sorted. Age, physical condition, beauty. These factors determined their fate. The most desirable, young, healthy, attractive, were sent to the royal harem or distributed among high-ranking officers as rewards for military service. One letter, written by an Assyrian general to King Esarhaddon in 681 BCE and discovered in the ruins of Nineveh, requests permission to keep 30 of the most beautiful captives from a recent campaign for his personal household, describing them as, quote, suitable for pleasure and display. Permission was granted. The next category Women too old or plain to be considered for sexual use but still capable of labor were assigned to temple service. This sounds benign until you understand what temple service meant. These women were not priestesses. They were slaves, forced to work in temple workshops producing textiles, pottery, and other goods that generated revenue for the religious establishment. They lived in barracks, were fed barely enough to survive, and worked until they died. The average lifespan, based on skeletal analysis of remains found in temple complexes, was less than 5 years after capture. The third category, those considered unsuitable for any productive use, faced immediate execution, not by clean methods. The Assyrians had a particular fondness for execution styles that maximized suffering and served as public spectacle. Impalement was common. Flaying, the removal of skin while a victim was still alive, was reserved for rebels but also applied to women from cities that had resisted especially fiercely. One relief from the palace of Ashurbanipal shows 2 women being flayed, staked to the ground while Assyrian soldiers peeled their skin in strips. Below the image is an inscription identifying them as the wife and daughter of an Elamite rebel leader. And then there was fire. The burning of women and children was not random savagery. It was policy. Cities that surrendered immediately were sometimes spared. Cities that resisted even briefly faced total destruction, which included the systematic burning of non-combatants. Archaeological evidence from sites across the Assyrian Empire, from Israel to Iran, shows layers of ash containing human remains, often in positions suggesting they were deliberately trapped in burning structures. Isotopy analysis of bones from these sites, published in archaeological journals in the early 2000s, indicates that many victims died not from smoke inhalation but from the heat itself, slowly roasted alive. But perhaps the most disturbing evidence comes from the Assyrians' own documentation of what happened to women after they were integrated into Assyrian society. Because some women survived the initial conquest, survived the march, survived the sorting, they ended up in Assyrian households as slaves, concubines, servants, and we know from legal tablets what their lives were like. The Middle Assyrian laws, a legal code dating from roughly 1200 BCE, but still in effect during the Neo-Assyrian period, contains sections specifically about the treatment of female slaves and captives. Some examples: a slave woman caught outside without her owner's permission could be punished by having her ears cut off. A slave woman who spoke back to her mistress could be punished by having her lips slit. A slave woman who attempted to run away could be punished by having her feet cut off. These were not theoretical laws. Court records, preserved in the archives at Ashur and Nineveh, document hundreds of cases of these punishments being carried out. One particularly detailed case from 706 BCE involves a female captive from a Syrian city who attempted to escape from her master's household. The court record notes that after her feet were amputated, she was kept alive and put to work doing textile production in a seated position, as an example to other slaves. She survived for 3 more years before dying of infection. The legal code also specified that slave women had no rights over their own bodies. Their masters could use them sexually without restriction, could lend them to guests, could force them into prostitution for profit. If a slave woman became pregnant by her master, the child was considered property of the master, who could keep it, sell it, or kill it at will. If she became pregnant by another slave or a free man without permission, she could be punished by having the pregnancy forcibly terminated, a procedure that, based on medical texts from the period, had a mortality rate exceeding 90%. Now let's return to Shali Ishtar, the woman at the front of the line in conquered Susa. Her story is not unique. It is representative. We know what happened to women in her position because the Assyrians were meticulous record keepers, and because later generations, Persian, Greek, Roman historians considered Assyrian cruelty worth documenting as a warning about the depths to which power could sink. According to the campaign records of Ashurbanipal, the conquest of Susa in 647 BCE was particularly brutal, even by Assyrian standards. Elam had been a persistent enemy, fighting Assyria for generations. When Ashurbanipal finally broke their resistance, he made an example that would be remembered for centuries. The city was not just destroyed, it was desecrated. The royal tombs were opened, and the bones of Elamite kings were taken back to Assyria as trophies. The temples were burned. The ziggurat was dismantled stone by stone, and the women, thousands of them, were processed according to the standard Assyrian system. Shali Ishtar, young and beautiful by the standards of the time, was sent to the royal harem in Nineveh. She survived the march barely. She was bathed, dressed in Assyrian clothing, given a new name that erased her Elamite identity. She was taught basic Assyrian language, and then she was placed in the harem, where she would spend the rest of her life in gilded captivity, available for the king's pleasure, forbidden from ever leaving, forbidden from speaking her own language, forbidden from practicing her own religion. She died 19 years later at age 42, never having left the harem building, never having seen her homeland again, never having been free. We know this not because her individual story was recorded, but because we have found the remains. In the ruins of Ashurbanipal's palace at Nineveh, archaeologists have discovered the harem quarters. Within those quarters are burial chambers where women who died in service were interred. DNA analysis of these remains, published in 2011, shows that many of the women were not Assyrian. They came from all over the empire: Elam, Syria, Israel, Egypt, captured in war, brought to Nineveh, kept until they died. Inscriptions in some of the burial chambers list cause of death. Childbirth was common, so was suicide. One chamber contains the remains of 7 women who died on the same day, with notation indicating poisoning, whether self-administered or administered by palace staff to dispose of unproductive harem members, is unclear. The archaeological evidence paints a picture of systematic abuse on a scale that challenges comprehension. This was not the action of individual cruel men. This was state policy, implemented by an efficient bureaucracy, documented in official records, celebrated in public art. The Assyrian kings were proud of what they did. They wanted the world to know. They wanted the world to be terrified. And it worked. For 3 centuries, the Assyrian Empire dominated the Near East through a reputation for such extreme cruelty that many cities surrendered without a fight, reasoning that even tribute and subjugation were preferable to what awaited those who resisted. But empires built on terror carry within them the seeds of their own destruction. By the time Ashurbanipal died in 627 BCE, Assyria had created so many enemies, brutalized so many peoples, left such a legacy of hatred, that when the empire finally began to crack, the response was overwhelming. In 612 BCE, a coalition of Medes, Babylonians, and Scythians besieged Nineveh, the city that had stood for centuries, that had seemed invincible, fell in just 3 months. And what the conquerors did to Nineveh was exactly what Assyria had done to countless others. They burned it. They destroyed it so completely that for centuries afterwards, people debated whether Nineveh had even existed or was merely a legend. The Greek historian Xenophon, marching past the ruins 2 centuries later, did not recognize them as the remains of the greatest city in the world. The women of Nineveh faced the same fate that Assyrian policy had inflicted on the women of so many conquered peoples. We don't have detailed records of what happened during the fall of Nineveh because the conquerors were not as meticulous about documentation as the Assyrians had been. But we can infer from the layers of ash, from the mass graves, from the fact that Assyrian population in the region essentially vanished, absorbed into other peoples, their distinctive culture erased. The cruelty the Assyrians had perfected was returned to them with interest. This is not justice. This is tragedy. Because the women who died when Nineveh fell were not the ones who had made policy. They were not the kings who had ordered the brutalization of other peoples. They were victims of a system that saw women not as human beings, but as tools, as rewards, as objects to be used and discarded. The cycle of violence, once started, consumes everything. Today, you can visit the ruins of Nineveh. It's in modern Iraq, near the city of Mosul. There's not much to see. Some foundation stones, fragments of walls. The sites have been further damaged by recent conflicts, by looters, by the passage of time. But if you know where to look, if you've studied the archaeological reports, you can still find evidence of what happened there. In museum collections around the world, the British Museum, the Oriental Institute in Chicago, the Louvre, you can see the reliefs that once lined Assyrian palace walls, the scenes of conquest, the piles of severed heads, the lines of captives being led away. And if you look closely at those captives, you'll notice something. Many of them are women, many of them are children. And the expressions carved on their faces. Stone doesn't preserve emotion, but the artists tried. Those faces showed terror. They showed despair. They showed the exact moment when hope dies. The Assyrian kings wanted us to see this. They wanted us to know what they were capable of. They succeeded, but what they didn't understand, what empires built on cruelty never understand, is that terror is a weapon that eventually turns on its wielder. That brutality, no matter how systematic, no matter how well documented, no matter how proudly displayed, carries a price. And that price, always, is paid in blood. The women whose stories we've uncovered through archaeology and ancient texts, they paid that price first. They paid it in captured cities. They paid it on forced marches. They paid it in harems and slave quarters, and unmarked graves scattered across 3,000 miles of ancient empire. And then the empire itself paid the price when the hatred it had sown finally bloomed into its destruction. If this story disturbs you, if it makes you angry, if it makes you question how human beings could do such things to other human beings, good. That's the point. Because these are not myths. These are not legends exaggerated in the retelling. These are documented historical facts, preserved in the Assyrians' own records, confirmed by archaeological evidence, cross-referenced with multiple independent sources. The cruelties committed against women by the Assyrian kings were real. They were systematic. They were celebrated. And they were, truly, beyond comprehension. Not because we cannot understand the mechanics of what was done, we have detailed evidence, but because we cannot understand how a civilization could build itself around such suffering and believe it would last forever. The ruins of Nineveh say otherwise.